Greetings and welcome to the first episode of the History of Repeating Handguns 1836 to 2025. This episode will cover the first major time period in history of repeating handguns, and this is between 1836 with the release of the Colt Paterson and 1850, the last year before the patent on revolvers in England and Europe expired in 1851. I have decided to name this episode the Colt years, as this period was marked by the Colt Manufacturing Company's monopoly on revolvers, in an age where older forms of repeating handguns would be tested alongside the revolver, to see whether or not they could outdo the revolver to become the prime archetype of repeating handguns going forward in time. It must be noted though, that the first repeating handgun was in fact not made in 1836, rather the lineage of repeating handguns goes back potentially centuries, but only in the 19th century with the extensive industrialization of the time could repeating handguns truly be mass-produced on a wider scale. However, while they did exist before the 1830s, they were not typically used until after the 1830s, primarily because of the dominance of muzzle-loaded single-shot pistols commonly used by the British, French and Americans in their various colonial wars, more often for the purposes of being used in pairs by horse riders, and lesser so for assassinations and duels, while rifles would often be the primary weapons used by soldiers. Before reliable repeating pistols became popularized, the typical formula for a single-shot muzzle-loaded pistol until around the 1830s would be muzzle loading due to a lack of sealed cartridges, a single-shot design due to little competition for repeating alternatives, a flintlock action as percussion caps weren't popularized until the 1820s, and by this point they were still relatively new, a 50 to 70 caliber bore, as having a large ball made up the difference made up by consistencies in measuring black powder, smoothbore barrels, as range was not a necessary feature on a pistol yet. Now, while this episode is about repeating handguns, the historical context of single-shot pistols is important when considering how handguns will change in the future, and when considering how the pistols of the pre-percussion era would influence the first revolving handgun, the Collier flintlock revolver. The Collier flintlock revolver itself consisted of these traits: a 47 caliber ball projectile, a 705 round cylinder, a single-action hammer, and a flintlock operating mechanism identical to those in use on single-shot pistols at the time. It also had rifle variants available, as would the later Colt Paterson. The weapon would be manufactured between 1818 and 1824, with several different models produced. Their military use was sparse, however around £10,000 worth of the weapons were contracted for use in India, amounting to around 160 guns sold in total. While percussion-based systems started to replace flintlocks in the 1820s, pistols would start to follow suit shortly afterwards, a popular example of which being the M1805 Harper's Ferry flintlock pistol, being replaced by the M1836 caplock pistol in American service. Considering this trend, there was a void created by the Collier flintlock pistol for a percussion-based alternative revolver. It only makes sense that some refinement would need to be made to improve upon Collier's design. So 12 years on from the end of the production of the Collier flintlock revolvers, Colt Paterson was born. The Colt Paterson is generally regarded as the earliest example of the percussion-based revolving handgun of the 19th century, an archetype it would help popularize thanks in part to the praise the weapon would receive from its limited service usage in the Second Seminole War, sometime between 1836 and 1842. However, it would receive sparse usage until 1865. The weapon was named Paterson for the place of its conception, Paterson, New Jersey. The weapon was revolutionary for its time, primarily due to the fact that unlike the traditional flintlock pistols already in service, the weapon both held far more than one round and also was simpler on the user to operate, thanks to the weapon not requiring additional gunpowder on the frizzen, as with older flintlock pistols. Therefore, a horseman with two Patersons would have 10 shots, as this was generally the age where reloading was seen as an off-battlefield experience, since it was generally quicker to use some kind of sword or other melee instrument when all shots from a pistol had been fired, and also because pistols were rare and soldiers with both a pistol and a rifle would use the pistol as an emergency backup weapon. This would also be true with the early Paterson, as until 1839, when its loading level was introduced, the weapon would need to be fully disassembled to be reloaded. The most famous Paterson model, the number 5 Paterson, was chambered for 5 shots of 36 caliber ball ammunition, making it less powerful than the earlier Collier pistol, but it still held the same number of rounds, and due to the percussion system, the Paterson could generally reload and fire faster than the Collier, and it was also more reliable too. The weapon's most distinctive feature, compared to later Colts, would be the exposed folding trigger, which was considered flimsy, likely due to how experimental it was for the time. Compared to the earlier 50 caliber rounds, the 36 caliber ball ammunition meant the weapon could be smaller and more compact, making it only slightly heavier than the single-shot flintlocks of the time, which could generally weigh between 800 and 1,000 grams compared to the Paterson's 1,200 grams. Considering the weapon had 4 more shots than these flintlock pistols, an extra 300 grams wasn't too much of a downgrade, especially since most pistoliers would be on horseback anyway, and the weight difference would be negligible on there. Other pistols sought to innovate in areas where the Paterson did not. Other common actions can be seen in 2 other popular revolving designs at the time, the pepperbox pistols. The Allen & Ferber pepperbox of Allen & Ferber of the United States was first produced in 1837, and these pistols generally held 6 shots of 32 caliber rounds. The Allen & Ferber pepperbox also had a double-action trigger, a shocking development for a weapon so antiquated. Another popular design was the 38 caliber Marriott pepperbox of Belgium, a weapon similar to the Allen & Ferber pepperbox, only with a double-action ring trigger, instead of the more conventional trigger present on the Allen & Ferber pepperbox. These pistols both had their advantages, namely they could hold more rounds than the Colt Paterson. The Marriott in particular could have anywhere from 4 to 24 barrels present at once. The issues present were far more devastating than with the Paterson, and even some single-shot flintlock pistols of the time. The first key difference, the lack of a central barrel. Possessing a barrel was a key to accuracy and range, as a barrel would allow for rifling to improve velocity, and also as a rudimentary guide for a shooter to get a better idea of how their shot would travel. The lack of a barrel meant that these weapons would often suffer poor accuracy, and even worse still, greater chance of so-called chain fires, instances where loading too much powder would cause all the chambers to ignite at once, potentially harming a shooter. The final, and less substantial issue would be that the caliber of these weapons was often weak, making them sufficient primarily for the purposes of being nothing more than an expensive experiment that with enough time and refinement could maybe be an alternative to a revolver in the future. The other type of pistol that would become seen as a poor alternative to the revolver would be the harmonica pistol. Harmonica pistols are one of the oldest and simplest types of repeating handgun. Their operation was extremely simple. Each shot would require the user to slide an array of barrels over, sort of like a rudimentary magazine. Compared to the pepperbox though, the harmonica had far more problems. For example, while the Fisher and Chamberlain harmonica pistol seen in this picture could hold an impressive 10 rounds, many considerations held back the pistol. From an utterly pragmatic standpoint, the weapon needs to rely on preloaded barrel blocks to be reloaded quickly. This could be fast, but it would be incredibly difficult to reliably transport preloaded barrel blocks due to the presence of loose powder seeping out the barrels, which could lead to an increased chance of a chain fire. Unlike other repeating handguns, the harmonica also had to have its magazine action manually operated by the user, which made it extremely slow to fire as well. Not only that though, but the gun would also have an unpleasant weight distribution, thanks to the odd horizontal magazine, which additionally made it difficult to tell whether or not the barrel was even aligned with the trigger as well. The pepperbox was not the only attempt to try and circumvent the revolver design patented by Colt in the late 1830s. This Cochrane turret revolver, a turret pistol, was developed as a type of horizontal alternative to the more vertical cylinders seen on pepperboxes and revolvers, like the Collier and the Colt. Compared to the harmonica and pepperbox designs, the Cochrane had a number of benefits, and those would namely be that while on a double-action trigger, the weapon could maintain a form factor similar to other pistols of the era and could be easily holstered, unlike the harmonica pistol. And unlike the pepperbox, the nature of a single distinct barrel also made the weapon easier to aim, and compared to both weapons, it also had a sound weight distribution too, thanks to its unusual cylinder. With all of these pros though, the weapon had many notable cons. The largest of these has to be the fact that the position of the firing pin on a turret revolver is so close to each of the barrels on the weapon, posing a potential safety risk thanks to the weapon's barrels pointing in so many directions. Unlike in something like the Paterson where the barrels all face the same direction, that at worst a chain fire would only result in an explosion that could maim a user's hand, whereas the turret design meant that a chain fire could also have the potential to injure friendly horses and soldiers in the field of battle. So with all of this considered, it should be no surprise that the weapon wasn't accepted into any kind of formal service. Turret designs were phased out quickly after the 1830s, and as to why they were phased out before worse harmonica designs, it's likely that a poor performing gun like the harmonica is more likely to have a longer production period than one that's both more complicated, more dangerous, and obsolete even in its infancy, such as the turret revolver. For its purposes, the Colt Paterson was entirely serviceable. However, it ran into issues regarding its stopping power against targets larger than your average enemy combatant. The Colt Paterson did not yet render the standard flintlock or single-shot percussion pistols obsolete just yet for a few key reasons, among those being the higher stopping power of the 50 caliber single-shot pistol, but more logical ones such as the specialized nature of pistols compared to rifles and muskets, the greater supply of muzzle-loading pistols already in circulation, the larger complexity and number of parts for revolving handguns, the relative hegemony of Colt as a revolver manufacturer, and the still relatively new industrialized world. Since the Paterson was more or less the first of its kind as a percussion revolver pistol, the Paterson was designed mostly as the first revolver to really get its foot in the door, in an age where other repeating actions were inaccurate at best and dangerous at worst. The Walker was designed to improve upon the Paterson, and as of such, it was designed to not only compete with, but to ultimately supersede the common single-shot pistols of the time. Designed to the specifications of Captain Samuel Hamilton Walker to be used in the Mexican-American War that had broken out a year before production started, the Walker revolvers chambered 6 rounds of a more powerful 44 caliber round, and the weapon was intended to be able to kill horses and soldiers with a single shot. This was in line with the philosophy of the time that each shot from a bullet amounted to the life of one enemy combatant, and as the Walker was intended to be held in pairs on a horseman, a Walker using soldier in the late 1840s would have the massive advantage of having 12 shots on hand at the start of a battle. This was also a notable improvement on the Paterson, which only had 10 shots which were only sufficient to kill soldiers with a single shot, and not horses. The Walker as a gun had a strange reputation, as being the most powerful pistol to ever be issued to the US Army, but more than that, the Walker was a dialogism in and of itself. It was praised and is famous for its extremely high power, holding the title of the most powerful handgun for nearly 90 years, overthrown in 1935 by Smith & Wesson's Model 27. The weapon's high capacity and more ergonomic design, especially in regards to the trigger guard, hammer and handle compared to the earlier Paterson, made it more comfortable to use if you disregard weight, and helped the revolver move away from the experimental and unusual look of the Paterson to the more refined look of later revolvers like the Colt 1851 Navy. It did have problems though. First and foremost, the pistols were fairly heavy, weighing around 2 kilograms compared to the 1.2 of the Paterson, and the roughly 900-gram flintlock pistols with the M1805, M1836, and the Caplock M1842 single-shot pistols. The second problem plaguing the Walker was that the weapon was fairly dangerous, as shooters often resorted to using lard to block off the cylinders in the event of a potential chain fire incident. Due to the high power of the Walker, chain fires were particularly dangerous, and due to repeated incidents of them, Colt recommended users load only 50 grains of black powder per cylinder rather than the maximum 60 possible on the weapon. Thirdly, the poor quality loading lever catch of the weapon would sometimes fail when firing, causing the loading lever to fall out and making fast firing with the Walker much harder as a result. The Walker would be followed by the Dragoon series of pistols, which saw far more total production than both the Paterson and the Walker combined. The Paterson had roughly 2,800 units made, and the Walker had roughly 1,100, whereas the Dragoon had around 18,500 made, spanning 3 different models, the transitional Whitneyville Hartford Dragoon and the 1848 Pocket model. The Dragoon was designed and produced in 1848, and its primary reason for existing was to improve upon the many issues faced by the Walker, the most important of which were in its unwieldy size and weight, alongside its propensity to misfire and destroy itself and potentially the shooter's hand. The Dragoon had a shorter barrel than the Walker, 7.5 inches compared to the Walker's 9 inches, and the Dragoon was 1.9 kilograms compared to the Walker's 2 kilograms. Due to the shorter barrel and the fact the Dragoon was physically incapable of holding more than 50 grains of black powder in each cylinder, the weapon had a slightly lower muzzle velocity than the Walker, and would therefore be far less prone to chain fire incidents, although in the pre-cartridge fire age, chain fires were always of a concern. The Dragoon has a unique distinction in that, unlike the previous Collier, Paterson and Walker revolvers that came before it, the Dragoon's larger scale of production meant that it became popular with civilians when it came out, the same year the Mexican-American War ended. This was especially exacerbated by the California Gold Rush of 1849, where the 1848 pocket model of the Dragoon saw popularity with the miners that travelled to the west coast to capitalize on the potential gold there. The Dragoon must also be noted for its significance in terms of its design. The Dragoon would go on to be produced until 1860, when it was replaced by the Colt Model 1860. However, the M1860 Colt would be part of the last generation of percussion revolvers before cartridges took over as the standard ammunition choice for revolvers. In the same vein, the Dragoon would go on to inspire the Colt M1851 Navy, and was sort of a companion pistol to the Navy, as the Navy used smaller 36 caliber ball rounds, while the Army used 44 caliber ball rounds. This would be the standard of US pistol ammunition until the 1870s, and the rivalry between Smith & Wesson and Colt would start to kick off with the Smith & Wesson Model 3 and the Colt Single Action Army. The final two pistols mentioned in this video will be the Colt Pocket Model revolvers and the Colette Gravity pistol. The pocket models were known as Baby Dragoons and saw variants in 31 and 36 caliber rounds, sharing 36 with the Paterson and 31 with the original Baby Patersons, produced around the same time as the original 36 Paterson. The production run of the Colt Pockets would be from 1849 until 1873, with the release of the Single Action Army, and the Pockets saw 325,000 units made for 31 caliber versions, and 39,000 for the combined total of Navy and Police pocket models in the 36 caliber. These revolvers had 5-round cylinders primarily, and can be seen as tiny Dragoon revolvers with Colt Paterson elements, condensed into a smaller frame. Like the variants say, the weapon was mostly used by police and naval officers, but only in the 36 caliber versions. The 31 caliber specifically comes from a variant of the original Baby Paterson revolvers made in the late 1830s. The Colette is more interesting. Being a Belgian manually repeating pistol that feeds via gravity, the Colette Gravity pistol used an early form of rocket ball ammunition, a rare type of caseless ammunition often mocked for its usage in the volcanic repeating pistol, and its weak stopping power being worse than that of the later 25 ACP round. The Colette is most noticeable as being one of the first repeating pistols to use only one chamber, holding 20 rounds of proprietary 9mm ammunition in a sort of slide above the barrel, feeding ammunition into the weapon via the incredulous force of gravity. The weapon never saw formal military service due to the obvious weakness of the ammunition, and was mainly a sporting pistol for leisure purposes, similar to how the modern .22 long rifle semi-automatic pistol is. The gravity action would have had potential if firearms moved towards the caseless approach, but it would not have been possible with percussion and flintlock systems, due to the complexity of those systems in locking rounds in place, and the fact that the weapon doesn't have multiple chambers for each percussion cap. Even a cartridge round would have been poor, as there was no real ejection system on the gravity pistol, hence why the gravity action never saw too much usage into the later repeating pistol eras of the 1880s and beyond. Considering the entire period of 1836 to 1850 as a whole, some trends start to show themselves in the world of repeating handguns. By the late 1830s, percussion caps had become the current norm of actions, replacing the earlier flintlock designs which dominated Europe and the colonial Americas throughout the 17th and the 18th centuries. The 1836 Brunswick and 1819 Hall rifles in America and Britain are both classic examples of this, and the use of percussion caps in repeating pistols based on older repeating models such as the pepperbox, turret, gravity and harmonica configurations, to name a few. Due to the prevalence of percussive, and albeit fairly waning, flintlock actions, the vast majority of firearms in service are still muzzle loaders. There is also no prevalence of a major caliber like would be seen later on. Rifles typically used rounds from 50 caliber up to the low 70s, while pistols like the Harper's Ferry series used the 54 caliber. By the end of the 1840s, American nomenclature had sort of shifted to adopt the 44 caliber revolver as a more specialized pistol, akin to how semi-automatic pistols would be seen in the late 1890s and early 1900s. 36 caliber revolvers would see service in more specialized roles outside of the main United States Army, while 31 caliber was likely intended primarily for civilian usage, and would have seen some attention as a backup gun, similar to how the 1825 Philadelphia Derringer was seen in its 41 caliber rounds. So with all of this being said, the Colt years are over and done with, going into 1851. This is the year the Colt patents on the Paterson-style revolving action would expire in England, and European gun makers would begin to craft their own takes on a revolver. While Belgium and Britain both contributed in smaller parts to the repeating handgun revolution, with experiments into pepperboxes and other alternative actions, they still brought Colt from this, and this would obviously need to change if countries like Britain would want to keep their status as global hegemon. Perhaps not the most important military development of all time, but repeating handguns would come to represent the ability of captains, generals, and all manner of important military and police personnel to possess a source of repetitive and sustained damage, in a form factor smaller than even the common short sword. Episode 2 will cover the period of 1851 to 1873, but until then, I hope this video on the period of 1836 to 1815 has been informative.